Anyone who has even slightly more than a passing experience with Middle-earth will be very familiar with the land of Gondor, as after all it is at the heart of much of what goes on in the original trilogy. And if you look at their geographical position, it becomes clear why this is, as they neighbour much of the more important players in the saga of the Ring. To the north, past the White Mountains, lies the land of Rohan. They border the sea to the south, and to the southeast they even have a border with the men of Harad. However, the most important border that Gondor have is of course the border with Sauron's realm of Mordor. This proximity to Mordor, and to a lesser extent Harad, do make Gondor the effective shield of the Free Peoples of Middle-earth in many ways. They are also not too far away from the rising realm of Isengard. Looking inwards, much of the more recognisable parts of Gondor lie to its east, nearer its border with Mordor, ironically. There are the White Mountains in the north, and also the Haunted Hills. However, the lands that are relevant here include Lossarnach, Pelegria, Ithilien, and of course Dol Amroth, who at some point will become a faction in their own right. All of these are subsidiaries of Gondor proper. Several of Middle-earth's finest fortresses and cities lie within Gondor as well, not least Caer Andros, the ruined city of Osgiliath, and of course the capital of Minas Tirith. With such close proximity to some of Middle-earth's darker influences, you could forgive the people of Gondor for being a little glum, especially after the failed attempt to destroy Sauron once and for all. Yet they still managed to be a very hardy people. Many of their units sport heavy armour, and also they have some of the finest spearmen in Middle-earth. All of this is very necessary because, of course, when Mordor comes, they come in force, and Gondor certainly can't outdo them in terms of numbers. Certainly with a defensive and a quality approach to their army, Gondor are more equipped than most to deal with the threat that Mordor pose, with their task being to hold the line against the Dark Hordes until relief can come from the west. And how they accomplish this with regards to their army is a mix of simplicity and rather high costs. So Gondor always were a pretty sturdy faction, mainly due to their spears and their heavy armour in vanilla, and they have been expanded upon pretty significantly in Reforged. In fact, so significantly that it is almost certainly going to be split off into two factions. Dol Amroth will probably become their own thing at some point in time, as I've mentioned. But nonetheless, for here, Gondor are still a whole faction, and going through their infantry, at least their non-ranged infantry, well, non-archer infantry I should say, starting off with their sword and shields, they have their Gondor militia of course. Now these guys they're okay because sword and shields are, you know, decently well-rounded units, but I honestly prefer militia which is spear and shield rather than sword and shield, because it gives them that extra ability against cavalry. And also, usually they can form Skiltron, a little bit better on the defense, a little bit more useful to sort of bog down the enemy for longer. Whereas the Gondor militia were honestly the one part of their army which were, on average, less durable than their counterparts in other factions, like the Arnor militia in particular was always very much more survivable than the Gondor militia. But nonetheless, this is their lower tier units, of course. The lower tier units are a little bit worse off in 0.7 of this mod, but I am certain that they will be buffed at least a little bit across the board, the lower tier units. But the Gondor militia aren't going to be the main centerpiece of your army. That's going to be these sorts of units, the Gondor infantry. These guys are obviously a lot better. They are pretty good on the attack, honestly. With 16 attack, that's not bad for a sort of middling sword and shield unit. Obviously, the Gondor units were always kind of expensive, even in the mid-tier. But the Gondor infantry here is a very nice unit to have. They're obviously very survivable. Looking at their army, you can tell that. They have no ability to form shield wall, however, which, you know, perhaps is a little bit disappointing next to some of their contemporaries, but they are also a little bit more focused on their attack, more so than their defense. But, you know, honestly, a pretty good unit, a very good central unit to base your army around. And of course, we have another unit like that in the Dol Amroth men-at-arms. They can form shield wall, a little bit more focused on defense, but again, this is likely to be Dol Amroth's sort of bread and butter unit when they get split off from Gondor, sort of the equivalent to the Gondor infantry. Both these units are very, very similar, and in cost and in effectiveness. But the two units which are Gondor's elite sword and shield units are the dismounted Swan Knights here and the Wardens of the White Tower over here. Now the Swan Knights, they aren't quite as good as they used to be in vanilla, simply because they aren't armor piercing. Armor piercing really is very, very important in Reforged, at least in this incarnation of it. because so many units have got good armor. So if you send your Swan Knights, despite the fact they are very survivable with a hit point and a decent defense score, they're going to struggle against units that are armored, particularly if you're up against a unit like the Wardens of the White Tower, or a unit like them, which does have armor piercing and has slightly better stats. The Wardens of the White Tower, one of my favourite heavy infantry units. Only four, well, they're basically around the same sort of effectiveness as the Smiths of Eregion and the dismounted Dunedain Knights. So it should give you the sort of weight class they're in, really, when it comes to overall effectiveness. They're also a stunning looking unit. Mounting guard with sword and shield as opposed to their halberds. But yeah, Gondor's sword and shield units were honestly a little bit lacking in vanilla because the Gondor infantry was a decent mid-tier unit, but at the high end the Swan Knights were kind of outperformed by several others, particularly the Dwarves, Arnor and High Elves. And that's still kind of the case with the Swan Knights, but now they have the Wardens of the White Tower, which means they certainly have a very well balanced sword and shield corps. They have 2 shock infantry now instead of just 1. In vanilla, all they had were the Axemen of Lossarnach, which these guys were okay because they were always, they did the job of being pretty high damage but low survivability units decently well, although I will say that now, because of the unit's higher defense all around, they are not quite as good as they used to be. They're still a nice cheap axe unit which you can use to send up on the walls first if you wish to use them for that, because they have 203 men in the unit is a significant amount. It essentially makes them a militia tier unit now. Decent amount of attack, and that's really what the cheap axes are all about. You want to send them onto the walls first, you want them to be the first to charge in to get their damage done quickly before they inevitably die off. Archers will shred through these guys as well, of course. No shields and low defense score. Well, low defense score in comparison to other things, at least, will count against them in a battle of attrition. However, then we have the Haven Guard. Another Dol Amroth unit, this. So they will not be in Gondor forever. But they are also the best shock infantry in the game as of right now, because their stats are extremely high, as I've said before. And also they have hit points. The damage overall is just, you can't really get away from it, and also the armor piercing ability. But yeah, if you put these guys into a choke point or charge them into an enemy infantry line, they will make quick work of them. They do have a slight tendency to be targeted by arrows, unsurprisingly, and they will take some significant damage simply because they're not a shielded unit, so defense is not their forte. They will last a decent amount of time in sustained melee, but these guys are going to be singled out simply because of how dangerous they are. Unsurprising, really. Moving on to the spears, though, and this was where Gondor were always very strong. And this is still the case, of course. The Gondor spears are a basic spear unit. Well, I say basic, mid-tier, because they aren't militia, certainly. They're very well armoured. They have shields, of course, and, they will hold the line for a long time. They don't have skill trom anymore. They have shield wall, which means, provided they're facing towards the enemy, they will be very difficult to break down. Important unit for Gondor, I would say, because if you have games where you're using decent funds, these guys are going to be sort of the centre of your army, even more so than the Gondor infantry, I would say, because the spears are where Gondor really excel. And then we have the 2 units of Citadel Guard. Essentially just a more elite variant of the Gondor Spearmen. One variant of this does not have hit points, the other one does. The hit points one is intended to be a General's Bodyguard unit, I think, because they are obviously more expensive. Both of them can form shield wall as well, basically just better stats than the Gondor Spearmen. And then, just ahead of them, we have the Tirith Aer Wardens, who are, again, just basically one step up from the more elite Citadel Guard. They have 2 hit points, one of the better spear units in the game as it stands. Nice looking unit as well. Obviously, spears will never be as good as heavy infantry or shock infantry on the attack, but when it comes to defending, holding a line, spears and pikes are the way to go, and the Tirith Aer Wardens are very, very good at this. They're also very good at dealing with arrow fire, obviously not direct arrow fire, but they will do a decent job under a significant amount of pressure. Very expensive though for spears, so that's worth bearing in mind. Now we have the 2 javelin units that Gondor have. The Pelargir Marines will be very familiar to everyone. Now this is a javelin unit, but they are ones that will throw their javelins and then charge in. In melee they're pretty decent. They're around the same sort of level, well, just over a militia level, or at least a little over complete trash. The initial javelin volley is meant to soften the enemy up before charging in, and it is also recommended that you will support these guys in melee, because they won't get much done on their own. They're not the most heavily armoured. But that initial javelin volley is good. They're a very big unit as well. The Pelargir Marines are a a useful tool to have actually as Gondor, because particularly I would say if you're attacking in a siege, where these guys will do very well, because you can throw your javelins into a pike line and then charge them in and try and overload that additional damage. The coastal wardens are a pure javelin unit in the sense that they will throw them until they are out of ammo unless they're engaged in melee. They do actually have less missile damage than the Pelargir Marines, but because they are able to throw more javelins with more reliability, I should say, because honestly I prefer it if the Pelargir Marines were a unit where you could just get them to throw their javelins over and over, more so than them throwing it and then charging them in. You often don't have time to micro that sort of thing. With the Coastal Wardens, they will just throw them over and over, simple javelin unit. This does show in melee, however, because their stats in melee are not good. They will be easily beaten by a lot of things in melee, as demonstrated by their very lackluster armor. And then we come on to another very important part of what Gondor is all about, and that is, of course, the pikes. The Dol Amroth pikemen are a basic pike unit. They're not the most heavily armored pikes, obviously, but they will still get the job done. Pikes are an area in which, if you get some cheaper pikes, they will still do the job. But you still need to be careful, obviously, that they don't get overloaded and shot with arrows. This is the problem with the Dol Amroth pikemen. Their armor is a little bit lacking compared to the higher tier pikes. Slightly better than them are the Guards of Osgiliath. Better armor, better defense score. They're not as good as they used to be in vanilla, so don't think that these guys will be quite the unit that they once were, but they will still get the job done. Of course, they're still a very good pike unit. A little bit expensive, perhaps, for what they are, but they will still get the job done. But of course, the best long spear unit, I should say, because it's more of a halberdier, are the Fountain Guard. 2 hit points, really the best long spear unit in the game, in my opinion, simply because they will last the longest. Very expensive, however, because they need to be because of how effective they are. Often this will be where the general is, but yeah, this is a real mainstay of Gondor. Very recognizable unit from vanilla, and they have certainly kept their effectiveness. If anything, they have become more effective in Reforged. But now we will move on to the cavalry and archers. Okay, so as you can see from the numbers, Gondor has a rather comprehensive archer and cavalry force. We'll start off with the archers, of which there are many. Starting off with the archer militia, of course, the lower tier archers. Honestly, the archers are an area in this submod in which you want to spend your money, because the archers have got a great deal of power to them. Gondor, incidentally, only have access to composite bows. They have no crossbows. Of course, they do have the Coastal Wardens and Pelargir Marines as javelins. But other than that, the archers are all composites. So the archer militia, the missile damage will increase as we go along the row, basically. The archer militia, they're cheap archers. You know what you're going to get from them. If you're doing a low funds game, it might be worth bringing the archer militia, but ultimately, you're probably going to want to spend a bit more money on your archers than just basic archer militia. You know what to expect from low tier archers. It's more of an orc thing to save money on your archers so you can have more infantry. The Gondor archers, of course, a bit more of a dependable unit, a bit more heavily armoured. Compared to the Arnorian heavy archers and the Bardian marksmen in particular, they were always a little bit lagging behind in terms of the human heavily armoured archers. It is still kind of the case, but fortunately Gondor have had more archers added to them, which adds to their effectiveness. But the armor on these guys is still pretty decent, so a very good unit to have, a very dependable unit. In Gondor, infantry, spears, and archers are basically the bread and butter units. Very simple but dependable. Then we have the Blackroot Vale archers. Now the difference between these guys and the Gondor archers, I should say, is that these guys had higher missile damage, decent missile damage, but they had lighter armor and were more susceptible to taking arrow fire. And this is still the case. The Gondor archers are slightly more survivable. The Blackroot Vale archers, a bit more missile damage. Honestly, I prefer having your archers be a bit more damaging than a bit more survivable, but that's just me. So I think the Blackroot Vale archers are a good compromise between having a slightly cheaper archer unit but keeping that damage that they have. It's a similar story, honestly, with the Dol Amroth archers, of course, basically very similar to the pikes. Their armor isn't particularly thick, but they will still deal a decent amount of damage for their price point. But moving on from here is where the archers get a little bit more serious. And of course we have the Athelian Rangers, which in terms of base Gondor are the best archers in terms of missile damage and overall effectiveness that they have. We have the basic Athelian Rangers and we have the Generals variant, which has more missile damage and has hit points, so they are going to be nasty to take on. In fact, the Athelian Rangers general unit is one of the better archer units in the game, at least in this variation of the game, but Whenever 0.8 comes out, that's when I will be doing the archers, and we shall see if these guys can make a sustained push for the top of the list. Because as it stands, this particular unit of Athelian Rangers is Gondor's best archer unit. The 14 missile damage and 2 hit points is what it takes, but of course you can only have one before the cost increases because it's intended to be a general unit. And putting your general in an archer unit is risky because the enemy cavalry is already going to be trying to get to your archers, and putting your general in them is like putting a big sign above them saying attack this unit if you can. It's risky. You're going to have to make sure you micro this unit effectively, otherwise it's going to be a real waste. But the Athelian Rangers, still a very good unit, very nice. I like the look of the Athelian Rangers as well. Nice roguish look to them. Then we have the Nimrodel Rangers, or Nimrodel. One of the two. I'm going to get told off because I got told how to pronounce this and I think it's Nimrodel. These guys can hide anywhere, as you can see, and they have 14 missile damage as well, just slightly better variant of the Athelian Rangers, but they don't have hit points, and they are a little bit lightly armoured, so, you know, the classic Ranger problem of having a lot of missile damage, but maybe not quite as survivable as you would like. Still a very, very good arch unit, though, one of the better arch units. Just about maybe squeezing onto the top 10 as it stands, maybe not. So you're looking at around sort of the 10th best archer here, sort of as an average. But yeah, I would suggest that you need to be careful with these guys though, because they are expensive and they're going to be singled out by enemy archer fire because of how thin their armour is, at least relatively speaking. They are still survivable compared to the lower tier archers, of course. And then we have the Tirith Air Marksmen. Now these guys, they have got much better armour of course, but they do only have 13 missile damage as opposed to 14. So that is basically their sacrifice. A little bit more survivability in exchange for less missile damage. So of course I prefer the Nimrodel Rangers because of the more damaging attacks that they have, but these guys are also very, very good indeed. It's important to have some survivability in your army, and sometimes this can be just what you need. You can only have 2 of each of these before the cost increases. Both of them, I think, classify as Dol Amroth units. I know that the Tirith Air Marksmen do. The Nimrodel Rangers, I think, also come under the Dol Amroth unit, so these 2 units may very well be removed from Gondor in the future. But moving on to the Cavalry, the Gondor Cavalry Militia, of course, low tier cavalry it's not going to fare up too well against most things. The only thing it's really good for is hunting down archers. Other than that, even enemy infantry is going to be able to do some significant damage to it. And enemy archer fire is a real problem for them as well. But if you want to bring some cheap cavalry to just sort of bog the enemy cavalry down, the Gondor Cav Militia isn't a bad bet. You know, there are worse cavalry units in the game, certainly. But moving on to the slightly more serious cavalry, we have the Gondor Cavalry, of course. Very basic unit. They don't have shields. You know, this is again, a very simple unit, similar to the archers, infantry, and spears. But they will get the job done. And also, if you increase their armor, they will get their heavily armored unit model here, which is obviously much nicer. But the Gondor Cavalry, a simple unit, to be sure. Then we have the Dor and Ernil Lancers. I think I pronounced that right. Obviously, a Dol Amroth unit. Essentially, this is the equivalent of the Gondor Cavalry, they look much more elite, but honestly the difference is they are better, but it's not a terrible amount more when it comes to the important things at least. And Dol Amroth has got a ton of good cavalry, it must be said. Even if Dol Amroth got separated off, they would still have the best cavalry in the game as it stands at the moment. But yeah, the Dor and Ernil Lancers are the lowest tier of Dol Amroth cavalry, and that should tell you how good the rest of them are. We of course have the Tirith Aeon Knights. Again, slightly better. Again, shock cavalry with their lances and their shields. Slightly better than the lancers back there. The General's Bodyguard is the best base Gondor cavalry unit, of course, and it's a General's Bodyguard, so you'll only have one, but you know what to expect from a General's Bodyguard in Reforged. It's got hit points. The effectiveness of some of the other units that Dol Amroth bring to bear is slightly better, but these guys are not a waste of space anymore. The General's Bodyguard units are now finally useful. The Swan Knights, of course, already made an appearance on the top 10 cavalry list. Still a very good unit, but they do lose out to some of the slightly more elite cav units that have been added now. Mounted Swan Knights, again, you know what to expect from them. Slightly better than their dismounted variants still. But the real stars of the show, it must be said, are the Knights of the Silver Swan. So close to being the best cavalry unit, the Imladris cavalry was the only thing that I found that was better. Such a good unit. They're slightly lower charge than the Elven units, but their overall defense score of 42 is extreme. Very, very good cavalry unit here. The pride of Dol Amroth, it must be said. And then finally we have a melee cavalry unit in the White Knights, and these guys are essentially mounted Haven Guard, as you can see, with the sword and shield. They have 2 hit points as well, and in terms of stats they are comparable to the Knights of the Silver Swan, although they are melee cavalry, so again, shock cavalry is slightly better than melee cavalry across every Total War game pretty much. But the White Knights I think are the closest I've ever seen to a melee cavalry that can really mix it with the shock cav, other than the Gundabad and Mordor units in this submod, because they function more as shock cavalry than anything else, honestly. These guys, again, are pretty much a hybrid. They're not quite as good as the Knights of the Silver Swan, and they are very expensive, but they are still worth your consideration because of how good they are, and they also look terrific, the Haven Guard. And of course the Siege, they have a ballista, a catapult, and they are one of the factions that gets access to a trebuchet. And the trebuchet is potentially very good, particularly if you're on the defense in a siege, because it forces the enemy to come forward perhaps before they're ready. And that can be very important indeed. But yes, that is Gondor and all their units, and I really like Gondor. They were my favourite in vanilla, and they've only become more my favourite in Reforged because of all the lovely new Dol Amroth units they get. But of course, Dol Amroth will eventually be split off, and then my loyalties will be tested, because honestly, most of my favourite Gondor stuff is from Dol Amroth, so I may have to defect to the Principality. But that was Gondor, the sparkly, brand new Gondor. Within the walls of Minas Tirith, it may very well be easy as a citizen of Gondor to be fooled into thinking the fight against Sauron is yours and yours alone, but truth be told, there are many who have fought such forces for far longer than men have. But that is a story for another day.